In this mini video, we're going to introduce the vbind directive, which allows us to update the values of HTML attributes, such as src, or href, or id. It also allows us to change the classes that are active in a particular element, and also to update the inline styling. So the app I'd like to build today is one in which you can select between a choice of images. The image you choose will be displayed in the box, and then you can decide whether you want to apply a grayscale filter to it, or whether you want to stretch it. Of course, this example has a few elements in the document already, but it's not quite functioning as I've described. So let's see what's there. First, let's look at the CSS. You can see that we have some existing classes for styling the box and the image displayed within it. We also have a grayscale class that we can apply to an image later. Next, let's look at the body of the document. We have a div element containing an image, currently mystery.jpg. We then have a form containing various radio buttons for the choice of image, a checkbox for whether you want grayscale or not, and finally another checkbox for whether you want to stretch the image or not. At the bottom, we have a Vue instance, and inside its data object, you can see that we have an images object. And this object maps cat, dog, mystery, and friss to various file names. Note that cat, dog, and friss actually correspond to the values of the radio buttons above. What I want to do now is determine which of the images that the user has selected. And I want to do this by setting up a two-way data binding using the vModel directive. The binding is going to be with a property called choice, and I'm going to give it an initial value of mystery, corresponding to the question mark image we get by default. When I go into the Vue DevTools, you'll see that the value of choice is automatically updated as I click on the different radio buttons. Next, I'm going to replace this hard-coded file name in the source attribute with some mustache syntax, extracting the relevant file name from the images object. Whoopsie daisy! It didn't work. Let's have a look at the Chrome developer tools to find out why. If we look inside the Elements tab and look at the relevant portion of the DOM, you'll see that the expected interpolation doesn't happen inside of HTML attributes. So how can we fix that? The solution is to use the vbind directive. Apart from writing vbind, we also need to specify the name of the attribute we're binding, as well as the application data that we're binding it with. Lovely! Next, let's handle the grayscale checkbox. Once again, I'm going to set up a two-way data binding using the vModel directive, but this time the value is going to be a Boolean value, indicating whether or not the box is checked. I'm going to call this property name isGray and give it an initial value of false. When I open the Vue DevTools and check the box, you'll see that the Boolean value is changing from false to true and back again. Now that we know whether or not the box has been checked, I'm going to set up a class binding such that the grayscale class is applied whenever that box is checked. We can do this using the vbind class attribute, but what should its value be? Well, Vue expects an object as the value. The property names of this object should be the names of the relevant classes, and the value should be true or false to indicate whether or not you want that particular class to be active in the element. In our case, conveniently, we want the class grayscale to be active when isGray is true, and inactive when isGray is false. And so we can simply use isGray as the value. Finally, we need to handle the checkbox for stretching the image, and I'm going to do this in a completely analogous way using a two-way data binding. The only difference is that the property name will be called isStretched. What I want to do here is set the width of the image to 1000 pixels when the stretch box is checked. This time, I'm going to implement this using an inline style binding, which requires a vbind style attribute. What does the value of this attribute look like? Well, again, it's an object, but this time it's an object of CSS properties along with their corresponding CSS values. For example, width and 1000 pixels. Setting the property name is easy enough. It's just width. But how do I go from the Boolean value stored in isStretched to a value of 1000 pixels or not? Well, I'm going to use a shorthand conditional notation, also known as the ternary conditional operator. And what this syntax means is the following. If isStretched has the value true, then use the value 1000 pixels. Otherwise, use the value empty string, which has the effect of not changing the width at all. Brilliant. The very last thing I'd like to show you is that because vbind is used so often, it actually has a shorthand notation, which is simply a colon followed by the attributes that we want to bind. And that's it for this mini video. We covered the vbind directive for setting up a reactive binding with HTML attributes. We looked at class bindings using vbind class, where we had to pass an object with the class names and then true or false values depending on whether we wanted those classes to be active or not. We looked at style bindings using vbind style, this time passing an object of properties and values. And finally, we briefly looked at the conditional ternary operator, which takes a condition and returns the true case if it's true and the false case if it's false. See you next time.